Thank you. And yeah, thanks for having us. We're very excited to be part of the Festival of Learning. And yeah, thanks for having us. So yes, I'm Deirdre Cole from London Marathon Foundation. I'm a senior funding manager with the foundation, have worked for LMF for about 5.5 years. And I'm joined on the call by some of my colleagues. So Hal is here, our Impact and Learning Manager, and Fiona, our Head of Governance, I can see on the call too, and maybe others. So I think as we get maybe more of a discussion and questions going, you might hear from others on the team as well. But in the main, you're going to hear from me. So yeah, I'll take you through what I'm going to chat through is just, here's the format, a chat through of London Marathon Foundation, a bit of an introduction to who we are and what we do and how we work, and moving towards where we've come to in terms of our open funding programme. So a programme that we were closed for a period and we've opened again, what we've learned along the way and what that journey has been like for us. I am more than happy to take questions anytime. Would love to hear other voices as well as mine. So please feel free to raise your hand or just shout and interrupt, or if you pop a question in the chat, might just ask my colleague Hal to keep an eye on questions in the chat. I can't see them while I'm chatting, but feel free to interrupt me if you see a question you want to read out in the chat, or to type away and answer in there. So yeah, here's the content of what we'll chat through, and I will kick off. So London Marathon Foundation, who we are. So yeah, you can see the early imagery around Chris Brasher and John Disley when they started the London Marathon. They also founded the London Marathon Foundation. So we've been going since 1981. We are now one of the major funders of initiatives that support people to lead active and healthier lives. That's very much our mission. So it's all about inspiring activity and getting people active, with a real focus on those that are furthest from the chances to be active. So those groups that are underserved, that are not well served by chances to lead active lives. In terms of the structure, we're the parent charity of London Marathon Events. So the event portfolio includes obviously the London Marathon itself, as well as other events. And then all of the surplus income generated by the events company comes into the foundation. And I guess just to note that, like, the success of that model is probably far beyond what was expected. Back in 1981, £10,000 was awarded to 7 projects. Since then, we've awarded more than 105 million to more than 1,700 projects all around our vision of inspiring activity. Most of our funding is spent in London. So originally all of it was spent in London. Now it's about 80%, 20%. So London is a huge focus for us. And I guess linked to the event that makes the most money for our trading subsidiary is London Marathon. London gives up its streets so that we can hold London Marathon, and London kind of gets behind the marathon to the huge extent that it does. And there is also lots of need in London. So we know that there's plenty of need and plenty of opportunity for us to have a really positive impact in that way. So that's the history of who we are. And in terms of how we have funded over that history, for most of our history, we have been a funder of facilities. So our focus was on what can we do to support organizations to build, renovate and modernize facilities so that more people can become and remain active. I guess in terms of the rationale for that being quite pragmatic, like for much of the foundation's history, we haven't actually had a staff team. It's for around the last 10 years that there's been a staff team. And before that, decisions would have been made by trustees. So I think other funders might understand, I guess, around trying to take that pragmatic approach. Funding facilities allowed us to have a legacy, built in a lot of natural due diligence, because if you're funding a facility project, there is a facility, there is a space, there's kind of a natural due diligence built in when it comes to checking how costs are being spent. It's in terms of looking into that, that's much more straightforward than, say, providing core funding to an organization and the type of support an organization might need if they're receiving that type of a grant. So quite a pragmatic approach around how can the organization have that legacy, what can we actually deliver with no or a very small staff team as we've grown. I think in terms of the scale and the breadth of types of facilities, that's where there has always been lots of flexibility. So we funded, when we talk about being active, it's a broad range of sports, a broad range of being active, of activities, from swimming pools, skate parks, church halls, community gardens, playgrounds, football pitches. I think a list of about 90 or so sports and activities that we consider part of how everyone might get to be active. Again, I'm very agnostic in terms of age. I guess being a funder primarily around sport and activity, a lot of what we fund does then go towards children and young people, because that's what a lot of the sector is concerned with. But we have also funded projects for older adults. We've funded ballet for dementia. We've funded projects that get older adults moving in terms of, say, chair-based activities. So while we've been quite rigid in being a facilities funder for much of that history, we've always had quite a flexible approach to what being active looks like and what that might mean for different people. Flagging around, I guess, prioritizing inspirational and sustainable facilities projects. But over our history, that's varied from like big high profile facilities like the Velodrome in Herne Hill, which is a former Olympic kind of a legacy project from back when London hosted the Olympics, to putting some swings into a housing estate. So the idea being to inspire people, not necessarily always by huge, big, high profile facilities, but sometimes to inspire local people to be active by making the space that they live in and inhabit and walk past every day, popping in some swings or popping in something that makes that space look a bit more like somewhere you could be active. In terms of the organisations that we funded then over our history as a facilities funder, that always has included charities, sports clubs, schools, local authorities. I guess in terms of being a facilities funder, that natural due diligence that we talked about, organisations have to apply to our funding when we operated like this, had to own or lease a facility. So as well as that providing a bit of due diligence that, those tend to be organisations that are fairly established, they have a lease, they have a space, they have a home, that did naturally exclude some organisations from being able to access our funding. So newer organisations, smaller organisations that didn't have that natural home, a space that they could call their own. They might be able to go and use a space that we had funded through a local authority, but they wouldn't be the organisation that we directly funded. And I think, we would acknowledge that the facilities funded during this whole period, they continue to deliver our mission. So that piece around legacy for us, if we funded a skate park or a playground X number of years ago, those spaces are still there and they're still being used. And we were very careful always about where those spaces should be. So in parts of London that were less likely to have lots and lots of opportunities to be active. So we feel those facilities still deliver our mission. Then the pandemic happened. So to bring everyone back to those days. And I think having always felt as a funder that we had this great model, that was we have our trading subsidiary and they deliver events and the income all comes to us. And I guess we felt quite robust and quite secure. We never needed to fundraise as such. We had our funding and our model was really robust. And then obviously the pandemic had a very instant and devastating effect on our income. So the marathon was cancelled. Most of the events that our trading subsidiary would deliver were cancelled. There was a lot of innovation and thought around what could still happen. So the event still happened in some format. People might recall there was an elite race where the runners ran around laps in St. James's Park. And there was the virtual mass participation event, which allowed people who had a place in the marathon to still run the marathon, but on their own in a local park or wherever they needed to be. So still to do lots of fundraising for their own personal charities. And it was amazing that still happened during that year. But in terms of income, the London Marathon Foundation immediately and greatly reduced our income. So our income generally comes year on year gift aided to us. We don't sit on a huge endowment or anything like that. So that had a very swift impact on our income. And also, I guess, the sector, obviously, in terms of facilities grants, people were no longer in a position to plan and build and deliver and modernise facilities. So with all of that in mind, our facilities grants programme closed to do applications in April 2020. I think at that time, there'd already been some thinking of what other types of funding, that the success of the marathon and the events up to that point had been such that we had funding and an opportunity to do more than just fund facilities. So some thinking had already started on that area. So we had started to offer small revenue grants to organisations that had come to us on the back of a facility project so that they could activate the space or run some outreach. So I guess the flexibility, the journey of London Marathon from a funder of just facilities had started before the pandemic. We had also started to offer larger grants to organisations to deliver their work outside of just, again, facilities funding. But yeah, I think the pandemic arguably kind of fast forwarded and fast tracked some of that. How it worked for us as a team, I know all funders went through such a journey at this period. How it worked for us, we weren't furloughed. We didn't have our grants program open. We still had all our existing grantees who needed a lot of contact and support from us around what kind of flexibility they needed. So if we'd made someone an award earlier in 2020 to build a facility and their plan was to start drawing down funding at X, Y, or Z time, it was us reaching back out to those grantees to say, well, what's needed now? Is it an extension? Is it a change in how that grant is spent? Has the rest of your partnership funding fallen away? And I guess just staying in really, really close contact with organisations during that period. Well, we had our full staff team, but we didn't have our grants programme open. So that literally was us reaching out to grantees, calling up, checking in to a much greater extent than we might have done before, where we did have contact with our grantees, but now we were checking in much more proactively around organizational health. How is everyone? What's going on for you in terms of your organization and in terms of the communities you're trying to reach? How have the needs changed? I think we all remember as well, needs changed and grew. So there were the inequalities that always existed and affected people we were trying to reach were greatly made worse during the pandemic. And we were very aware and very conscious of that. So that point around reaching out to existing grantees, that turned into then giving people greater flexibility. So back to our trustees for decisions around, could funding be repurposed and spent in a different way to allow this organisation to survive during the period, or to allow them to offer something to flex what they were offering as and when outdoor activities began to be possible, or different types of activities and sports began to be permitted under the rules that existed around COVID at that time. During that period, those top-ups and awards to our existing grantees allowed people to deliver new activities, different activities, transform how they were operating during that period. And they also gave us as a staff team and our trustees just a much closer connection and understanding to our grantees, where before we'd been paying them to build a facility. Now we're working with them to understand what do they need, what's happening for their organisation, what's happening for their communities in a much more live and close way. We also signed up to the IVAR Flexible Funders Commitment during that period, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. And we spent a lot of time just really thinking about what did that mean for us during this period and what does that mean for us now. I guess a real focus on delivering our funding more flexibly and communicating with purpose. Those were probably the two that jump out around that period. So flipping from all we can fund is bricks and mortar to now we can fund you to run some summer activities for children to come and take part in activities at a park. And then also communicating with purpose. So we were reaching out to our grantees to find out how they were, but there was an offer like, tell us how you are, tell us what you need, and we can come back to our trustees to get a decision on what we can fund for you. So that purpose felt very live during that period. That then led to the Active Communities Fund, which I will go on and speak about. So the Active Communities Fund was a new fund that we launched kind of during this period, where again our funding had been completely kind of slashed, but we didn't have no money. We had much less money. So I guess in context, we might have had between 6 and 8 million a year before the pandemic. I think during this period, and the budget for the Active Communities Fund was around 800,000. So not by no means nothing, but greatly reduced from what we were used to having and what we were used to spending. And the timing didn't feel right to reopen our facilities funding programme, which had closed in April 2020, because the stability didn't feel like it was there for the sector to say we're now ready to start building and planning and putting in place long-term plans to build projects. I think organisations were still trying to work out how they were going to survive and flex during that period, and that long-term planning wasn't possible for people. So I guess what we did was think about, we have our staff team, we have a bit more of a steer on the flexibility that we can offer to our grantees, where it no longer needs to be just bricks and mortar and what we can build. And we also had in our mind, there had always been parts of London that we hadn't been able to fund as much in, because again of the model of the facilities grants programme. So if to come to us under our facilities programme, you had to own or lease a facility, then if there were parts of London where there are fewer facilities already, like that naturally rules out those parts of London from coming forward to apply to us as much as they can. Or if there are parts of London where the only organisations that do own or lease those big spaces for sport are the local authority, you're relying on that local authority having funding in place, having plans, developing projects that we can then partner with. So I guess in terms of grassroots groups and community organisations, they were the least likely to be able to come forward and apply to our funding programmes. We always had in mind, when we talked about what those cold spots were, Barking and Dagenham was a big one for us, where again we knew there was a really vibrant grassroots and community sector. It was the part of London that we had funded the least in over the course of our history, despite there being this vibrant active sector and there being lots of need in that area too, and lots of inequalities that affect people. So when we thought about our Active Communities Fund, which I'll explain what it was, we focused in on Barking and Dagenham, Newham and Tower Hamlets. We had less funding, so we couldn't do it for all of London, and we wanted to pick parts of London that were really, really affected during that COVID pandemic period by inequalities, which were becoming more and more apparent during that period. So based on population, deprivation, activity levels and kind of data like that. And then also based on where had we had the least impact as a funder. So we picked those 3 boroughs and we offered we went out to communities and networks and groups in those boroughs. So in Barking and Dagenham, we work quite closely with BD Giving, who are one of London Funders members, for example. I think what we were trying to do was offer something place-based, but not launch our own place-based network. Instead, to go to the networks that were already there, and basically say, we're here, we're London Marathon Foundation. We were called the Charitable Trust at the time, but we're London Marathon Foundation. We want to support you to offer activity and chances to be active to the communities we want to reach. What do you need? So it was a little bit like what we had done for our own grantees, but it was going out to new organisations instead. So we tried and tested our approach of going to our own grantees to see what their needs were. Now we were going out to new organisations to say, what are your needs? It no longer needs to be bricks and mortar and what we can build. It can be what you actually need to allow you to do what you want to do for your community. There was a really explicit focus on grassroots groups with strong relationships with their communities. That's the type of language that we had in mind. So I think we were very mindful as well of narrowing in and focusing on these 3 boroughs. What we didn't want to do was attract larger, more established charities who obviously have their place in the sector as well. But this wasn't about attracting someone to say, great, we'll start delivering in Barking and Dagenham. We can follow your funding and deliver in that area and come up with something really great. This was more about who are the groups that are already there, that are always going to be in those areas, and that relatively small for us amount of funding for those groups can give them that kickstart and that stability to stay operating in their area and keep meeting the needs of those communities in the longer term. I think what we found when we did go out and meet and spend lots of time speaking directly with grassroots groups through those networks was really the importance of patience and building trust, which I guess we knew, but they really jumped out. I think the grassroots groups told us so clearly their frustration at funding programs being launched in their area to say, we're coming, we're going to save you, we're going to offer you 1 month of funding, or 1 month to prepare an application, and then come into us without much time to plan or prepare applications or collaborate or work in the ways they would like to work with their own sector and their own communities. So that patience was really key, and that building trust. I think we were, again, a brand new big funder dropping in, and the people were very used to that happening. Funders kind of dropping into their area to say, you've got lots of need and we can help meet it, but this is how we're going to do it. So instead, trying to build that application process with the sector and build that trust. So that was the purpose, and that was what we wanted to do with the Active Communities Fund, to deepen our connection to those grassroots groups, and I guess therefore deepen our connection to the actual people that we want to reach. So if you only fund bricks and mortar and facilities, you're just at a bit of a remove from the actual people that we want to reach and we want to get active. And by funding grassroots groups, that brought us much closer to that. And I guess it allowed us as well during that period, I think as all funders felt that real pressure and that real need, our open programme had closed, but there was still something we could offer to the sector. So we were able to respond to that need even while our budget was limited. So that was the Active Communities Fund. Then, I guess, I can wrap up a little bit more on Active Communities. We awarded, I think, about 800k through that fund across those 3 boroughs. We managed to kind of respond to avoid that issue of generating lots of demand that we couldn't reach by having that patience and giving the sector time to collaborate and come forward, let them know roughly what the budget is, and let groups in those areas come forward with their proposals, having worked together to know, you're going to apply for something in that part of the borough, well, I'm going to apply for something here, and then we could all come forward together with our applications at the same time, rather than everyone feeling they had to compete and be nervous and be anxious about that process. So yes, it happened. We delivered the Active Communities Fund. Then, in terms of what next, obviously mass participation events returned. I think that photo is from the 2024, from this year's marathon, which had a significant and swift impact on our budget. So again, in terms of how our funding is structured, once everything was back and everything was running again in a profitable way, our budget was back and our budget was restored. I think we learned a lot from the Active Communities approach and the Active Communities process, but we were conscious it was only delivered in 3 boroughs, and it didn't feel like something we could roll out across all of London, and recognising the staff time that it took to really do that properly and do that well, and that didn't feel like something we were well placed to do. I think we were also conscious of the gap that we had left for the sector in operating an open fund, having this facilities fund that had operated for much of our 40-year history, and then taking that away. So I think there was a desire to think about having that open application process, that anyone in London who wants to develop a project to do with inspiring activity knows that we're here and we can support that. But yes, we wanted to embed the learning. What had we learned from our Active Communities Fund, and how could we change and tweak our facilities programme to make it better deliver what we'd learned through that process? So the key things that we wanted to take forward were that patience, building relationships, focusing on organisations trusted and embedded in their communities, and the flexibility in terms of the costs that we could fund. Those all felt like really key things to keep. So I think what our mission and what we're trying to do is embed the learning from the Active Communities Fund, but recognise that, yeah, we couldn't launch that approach and run that approach across all of London, but that we can embed it into what we are offering. I'm really apologise, but I have to go and get the charger for my laptop, so you're going to have to bear with me. Maybe Hal or Fiona want to say anything, or if there's any questions in the chat.
Good timing. That was good timing. I was just going to say, did anyone have any questions at all at the moment? I know we've got been through, so I suppose the history, facilities fund, and a bit into the active communities fund, and I know Deirdre is going to move on to the active spaces fund, which is now our open program. So does anyone have any questions at the moment? Yes, Marlene.
I have one, if I might be cheeky and use my positions, London Funders member. I just really interesting to hear about how you kind of move towards more trust-based and flexible ways of funding. And we know a lot of our members are doing the same, but also some are kind of on that journey. And I think what we're hearing a lot is sort of how do you manage that change in approach with trustees, and that, you know, these can often be the ones that are hardest to convince, if there's some hesitancy there. So just curious kind of how you manage that process, and if you have any insights into sort of engaging with your board or decision makers in that process.
I mean, I can answer that, and then maybe Deirdre can add in as well. I think so at a really basic level on those, that we have these 5 funding commitments, which, as Deirdre mentioned, 2 of them are about being flexible and trust-based. So we survey grantees at different points to essentially find out how we're doing against those. So far, the feedback is pretty good. The grantees feel we are kind of living up to those commitments, and we use things like, if we have webinars in other communications, we use those as opportunities to explain what we actually mean, because I think sometimes they can seem like words on a website, on a page, and actually explaining, we mean this in practice, we do this in practice. So it would be for being flexible. We understand that things change. So if we've set outcomes and outputs as targets, our approach isn't going to be, well, you set those so you absolutely must achieve them. We want to build a relation and have a conversation with grantees. So I think it starts with the surveying. So we then report and talk about what we're seeing in the surveys within our team, and then with trustees as well. And then there's a few different things, but I think from my side, it's probably calling out things that don't feel they do fit into those commitments. So if something is happening in one of our trustee meetings at board level, being able to use that to say, well, actually, if we've said we want to behave this way, can we just check ourselves, does it feel like that is in line with that? If it's not, why are we doing it? So I think us being able to have honest conversations and tough conversations with our board and trustees as well. But Deirdre, I don't know if there's anything you'd add to that.
Yes, and I'm back plugged in, which is all very reassuring for me. I think back to thinking about the Active Communities Fund, which was, if you think of much of our history being around building facilities, it was a real departure and a brave new step, I think, for us. I guess the background and the context to it is, I think there were a few things that came together. We always had in mind, Barking and Dagenham was always on our mind, and of these other parts of London that like our funding wasn't reaching, and no matter what we did, no matter what conversations we started, and then you look and go, well, actually, it's the structure of your funding program. Like that's the reason that people can't apply. It's not because they don't know about you. It's not because they don't want to have great facilities and spaces in their area, but actually they need the groups that are proactive and ready to take on the funding and deliver the funding don't meet the eligibility requirements for our program because they're not leaseholders or they don't own their facilities. So I think our trustees understood that and got that, and were then really open to saying, well, actually, what do we need to tweak and how do we need to change that? And then I think the beginnings of it, it's funny thinking of the language. We had our facilities funding program, and we'd started to have something we called a revenue tail, which was if we funded your facility, so if we funded your space, you could also add on, and there was a lot of debate over percentages. I think it was 10% of the total project cost could be towards revenue. So you could say to us, we will build your facility, and then you can, as an organization who owns and leases your facility, you could also add on this revenue amount that will allow you to do some outreach and maybe change who comes to your space, and try out and pilot some new things that we know you might need to do to engage the communities you want to reach in our space. So I guess it was step by step, and everything actually felt fine. It turned out we did deliver revenue funding, and it was fine. During COVID, we reached back out to our own very trusted group of funded organisations, and we delivered revenue funding with them in a much more flexible and open way. I guess COVID kind of forced our hand on that occasion, but there was willingness and a real desire to do that. And again, that felt fine. So all these little steps towards it. Then when it came to the Active Communities Fund and how that was pitched and how that was presented, I think there was nothing new that we were doing, but we were just doing it in a slightly different way. And I think the fact that I guess our funding was on, our larger funding program was paused, the team had time and the trustees had time. I think for trustees to feel really comfortable with the decisions they're making, they need time, and to not feel that it's been rushed. So we had lots of time to talk together as a team and talk to them and answer their questions, which was really helpful. And when I think about the learning as well, I think that's our team learning that. For us, that's really helpful as well, around what other ideas do we have, or do we kind of know from the sector that we need to push forward to trustees. I guess their openness to it as well, where I think there might have been caution, like what will the trustees say about this? Actually, they were really open to it, and they were really glad to have an opportunity to get out to these areas and sectors that we hadn't been able to fund before. And then I think the other part, we definitely, we worked, as I said, with Embarking in Dagenham, and we worked quite closely with BD Giving. They had already established kind of networks that were very focused on participatory grant making. We didn't launch or kind of bill Active Communities Fund as a participatory grant making approach. So I guess our trustees, they didn't hand over decision-making power, but in the process, we basically, one of the reasons your organisation, your project might have been recommended for funding to our trustees was on the basis that it had come through this process, this collaborative group that were working on a participatory approach of what could happen in their local authority. So it did inform decision making, but we didn't have to come forward with a radical, let's completely transform how decisions are made in our organisation. So the decisions were still signed off by our trustees, but they were signed off on the basis that everyone felt comfortable with the process they'd gone through in those local authority areas and with those networks that already existed. So yeah.
I think so. We have a question from Christina, who's been waiting, and then we've got a question from in the chat from Sarah, and then Fiona. So Christina, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask a question.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning. It's been really interesting. I guess like listening to this. I'm quite new into, well, not new, but I really want to be able to learn and understand more about funding. With the stuff that you were talking about in terms of connecting with communities, do you do workshops on applications? And I was just wondering, because I really wanted to learn about, I'm quite open to learning more about how you engage communities with those applications if they're changing, and is there any current workshops that you have on at the moment? And how do you get onto those?
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, I will. I think in terms of Active Communities Fund, I'll answer that first, and then in terms of what we have now as well, we actually, the process for Active Communities Fund was we didn't even have an application form at the point of having the conversations. It was much more open of just tell us what you might need. And we sort of designed an application process then that was just a way of us capturing the information for people, rather than a way of us like assessing and deciding and judging, like, are you the best? Is this the best project? It was more like, we actually know the organizations, we've chatted, we have a fair sense of where things are coming from. Again, possible to do that because we were focused in on those really on quite finite geographical areas. The reality is we couldn't operate like that across all of London. Like it wouldn't work in terms of just, I guess, efficiency and how our team can feel like we're open. I think it's that balance of like, we're open and we want anyone to be able to fill in a very short form and tell us about their project, or anyone to pick up the phone and speak to us, or anyone to be met at an event or contact us in any of those ways. So trying to, I think not have people feel they have to have come to a webinar or have to have had that direct contact with us. So that's where we've got to, where we have our application process, which I'll speak to a little bit later on. We yeah, we're very open to running webinars. We ran one with Sported and their members recently around trying to let people know. I think that's again the next part where we talk about what's open for us now and how we try and take the learning from this is that, yeah, we do need to be proactive and keep an eye still on what are the cold spots for us, who's not coming forward to funding, who doesn't feel they know what we offer and how we could work with them and what's the best way to engage with them. And definitely that is via us like attending in-person events, attending webinars.
Just to check then, so you're open to having conversations still now, like with...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have an open fund, which I'll chat through in more detail in terms of the fund, how it currently works. So Active Communities Fund has closed, but we're embedding what we've taken forward from that, and that's the punchline at the end. Is what we still offer.
Thank you so much. So I will be in contact.
Thank you. Cool. Question
Yes, yeah. Do you want me to read it out? So it's from Sarah. So it says, I'd be interested to hear about how you've sustained the relationships with the groups you've worked with in Active Communities. So if we have done, and how we've sustained relationships with Active Communities grantees.
Yeah, I think that's, again, that is also really interesting. And I think what we've seen, one thing we have seen is we do now receive more applications in the program that we have open from those areas. So I guess we feel that we have been able to, we have still been able to receive applications from those areas where we didn't before, which is both to do with us making our process more open and accessible, and then we hope through to us building trust and building relationships. Individual grantees through Active Communities will have had contact with an individual, their funding manager, who will have managed their project. They may have had some contact with HAL as well, in terms of impact and learning and the MEL. I think we would definitely say that as a team, capacity-wise, this is again where us trying to have a truly, to claim to be a truly place-based funder who can go in and capacity build and support organizations. I think we don't think we have that capacity with the size of the team that we have. So that has been a challenge for us in terms of Active Communities Fund and the conversations we started and relationships we started, and then the return of kind of higher levels of funding and higher volume of funding, and that need to open a fund that opens all across London. So yeah, I think it's still on our minds in terms of more we can learn from the groups that were funded, how the process was for them and what learnings we can keep taking into account. But they remain, some of them are still active grantees of ours, some have finished their projects. Do you have anything to add, Hal, I guess, in terms of?
No, not on that. I think you covered that. That's all. Yeah, all good. Does that answer your question, Sarah? Is that perfect? Cool, thank you. And then we've got a question from Fiona.
Yeah, might be funny to have a question for me because I work for the foundation. I've been here for 2 years, but just to clarify, I'm a head of governance, so I don't actually work on the funding side. I admire everything they do, but it's been fascinating, Deirdre, to have that background and the history. So thank you for that. But I actually do have a question as to whether we work with other funders in similar areas so that we're not overloading, one particular area, or I don't know. Yeah, do we collaborate or collude? Not collude, that's the wrong word, but yeah, liaise.
We do, and I think that's where we were very, very fortunate, particularly I mentioned BD Giving a lot because they were particularly well placed to help us with this exact approach because it's so closely aligned to how they work with communities already. And I think we try to do similarly when we think about different places around London. Are there funders that have that connection already? We have such a focus, our mission is so focused on inspiring activity, so we know there's a need that goes way beyond that. But we also know that if the needs people are trying to meet can be met by sport and activity in a really broad way, where it is around getting people access to chances to lead healthier lives, to connect to their communities, we know it does much more than just getting everyone moving. So yeah, I guess we try and stay connected and try and keep that in mind. And when we're thinking especially about cold spots or areas that we need to know more of, other funders are a really good connection for us to do that.
Brilliant, thank you.
So we've got one question from Nicola, and then do you want to dive into the final part on active spaces, and then we probably have a bit of time afterwards for some more questions. But yeah, Nicola.
Possibly a similar theme. I was thinking, or I've been doing some thinking about kind of what good exit from relationships looks like, and aware that funders have opportunities to connect to organisations. There's other things we can bring. So yeah, I just wondered if you'd thought about that kind of what good entry and exit looks like, which might also link to the co-funding question, or it might link to kind of some other things that you offer your grantees.
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I think it brings up, I think, that our journey from being a funder of facilities to being a funder of organizations in a different way. Because again, when you fund a building, actually you just go and visit the building. And we would, like I said before, we would check in and know those organizations and know how they were working. But our part was so defined. We built your building and now you can use your building. Whereas now providing funding that's more about helping organizations to sustain and survive and try out activities, I think that has been I think we would acknowledge that's a shift for us. And I think we're still working to fully capture, what level of, what does that look like for us, and what level of support can we offer to grantees, and who else in the sector can step in and offer that support. So that's where, again, it's funny delivering this session. It's not because we think we have all the answers. So it's really helpful to get questions like that, because it's on our minds as well. I think, especially when it comes to real revenue and core funding into organizations. Again, I think all funders are guilty of saying, and then it has to be sustainable when you're finished with us, but we haven't always really been able to look at, like, what does that actually mean to us, and what do we do to help with that, and what do we expect to track along the way to show how it's going for you. We do, as well as the open funding program that I'll talk about, we do provide some larger grants that are to organizations that are delivering at a much bigger scale, and we work much more closely with those organizations. But I think I think some of it will be answered by the next little bit on our Active Spaces Fund, and some of the rationale for why we have kind of refined the process, where there's still a lot of flexibility, but we don't provide core funding to organizations through there's a spoiler alert, we don't provide core funding anymore through our Active Spaces Fund, in part because of that. I think trying to recognize what's the best role that we can offer through this part of our funding portfolio. We have other funding that we deliver as well through our partnerships fund, and we have other funding that we deliver that does provide core funding. But in terms of where this part of our funding portfolio evolved, I'll try and answer that, and if I don't, ask me again at the end. I think it'll be answered as we go through.
Thank you.
Cool. Shall I carry on? I will carry on. So yeah, what next? Everything came back as I've kind of chatted through. And I think, one thing we were conscious of was that stability that the sector had from us for much of our history around having an open programme, a really clear offer. You knew if you had a space in a facility in London, you could come to us at that point in your organisation's development that you wanted to develop your facility, you could come to us. And I think we wanted to keep that open door part, but then embed the learning that we'd had from our closer relationship with our own grantees, and then through our new grantees from Active Communities Fund as well. So what we have now is called the Active Spaces Fund. So this is our open programme. This is open today. This is open all the time. And I guess I'll chat through, this is how it works at the moment, and I'll chat through a little bit of where we got to this point. So there's an ongoing learning piece for us in how to deliver the fund. At the moment, how this fund works is there is a focus on capital projects still. So that's still something we want to say very clearly to the sector. There aren't that many funders that fund capital projects for sport in London. So we didn't want to take away that focus, so that those organisations that need that can come to us. But what capital might look like could include, it could include equipment, it could include much smaller refinements to a space than, like, I'm building a brand new sports hall. So capital projects still have a place within the Active Spaces Fund, delivered by an open fund where you can apply all year. And I think that's really key for us to have that patience piece, that people don't feel like this is going to be something that's open now and then closing and then changing and then opening and then maybe gone, so that people can really feel they can be patient and have time to develop their projects, talk to others in their space, talk to us, and come in with an application when they're ready. So that's a really key part of how it operates. So having said, capital projects remain important to us, and we don't want to take them away from something we'd fund through Active Spaces. Revenue funding is much more explicitly part of it. So you don't have to own or operate a space. There might be a space in your local area that's not used very much, and you might think, we could have an outreach post, we could pilot some activities in that space. I can make that space an active space. I think, again, during COVID, we kind of saw little parks that have been very unloved and, like, not had much action and activity but then suddenly during COVID became these spaces where people ran exercise classes and did different things. So trying to, I think a little bit more creatively about what protecting and making a space for being active could look like. In terms of the application process, we wanted to keep it as lean and simple as we could. Again, try to keep the burden and time drain for organisations around how to apply to us for funding. So there's a very short expression of interest, then there's a more detailed application. There's a lot of contact and feedback from our team at each stage. We certainly are open to running more webinars, and we will run webinars and do run webinars to try to demystify that process. But I think what we're trying to keep in mind for us is really that application process. It's just a way of telling us about your project, and I think we really mean that when we say that. So trying to stay away from like that it needs to be perfect and polished and developed. It's much more about tell us your idea, tell us what's happening, tell us a bit about your organization. It might be that you go into a pipeline for us. It might be that we follow up with a phone call to find out more. We could connect someone up with another partner in the area, rather than it being a apply into us and the next thing you'll hear is a yes or no from an automated email account in a few months' time. So trying to build relationships through our application process. Does feel important to us to be open to everyone, because I guess in part, while we want to work through existing networks, we know that not everyone is in those networks already. So even the kind of the networks that exist, to try to tap into the grassroots groups and grassroots communities that feel they're on the outside or on the edge. There are others that aren't even in those networks. So we do want to really be open to all, but to have a targeted approach to our engagement. So keeping an eye on, are there cold spots for us? Where do we need to have more of a presence? What partners can we work with to try and get more applications from particular parts of London? And this is only open in London, I should have said. Majority of grants are less than 80k, more than that is by exception. I guess that is, in terms of those larger grants, that's much more focused on the capital funding idea. So it obviously costs quite a lot to try to build or renovate a facility, and we're aware of that. But we do offer much more smaller grants as well that are more around what can I do and what can I deliver in a year or in 2 years. And when I mentioned webinars at the bottom, that's around contact with grantees, with applicants, with those that are coming through the programme, as well as then keeping our ear to the ground and out and about with those that haven't yet come through. Having HAL in post as well, I guess that impact on learning post existing, that post didn't exist for much of our history as a facilities funder either. So HAL plays a really key role around having someone who's actually present on our team who can take the learning and work with the team to apply that to our programs in a very direct way, rather than kind of, we'll run this for 3 years and then we'll evaluate it and see what happened and then launch a new program on the back of what we learned from our old program. It's a much more kind of a live process for us. The other part, I guess, that's key is around our priorities for the Active Spaces Fund. And some of this, again, is about embedding what we learned from the Active Communities Fund. So just being really clear and upfront, this is what it says on our website around what we're trying to do. This is what anyone applying to us needs to understand about what we're trying to do. Probably the key bullet point is that third one around delivered by organisations with a close connection to the community they want to support. I think trying to recognise and what we heard when we delivered Active Communities was lots of organisations having that experience of a new fund is launched in their area, and then a great big shiny organisation comes in, applies for all the funding and delivers that project, and the grassroots groups that are already active in that area feel they missed out and feel they were pushed out by that process. So trying to be really clear and explicit and have that, and as Hal said, have that as part of what we capture in our application process, part of what we consider, and part of what we remind our trustees of as well. So that's at the front of everyone's mind when we're making decisions and making awards. So those are that's the priorities that we wanted to capture. And the key, I think, again, in terms of our facilities programme, we were always clear that the projects we funded were in the right places in London. So we did consider need and we did consider deprivation and activity levels, but we didn't have that captured around the organisations with a close connection, that we wanted to make sure our funding could more directly reach those organisations. So last year, we awarded £4.3 million to 143 projects across London. I should say I was on maternity leave last year, so well done to the team who did all of this. But this is just a real snapshot of what happened last year. In terms of budget level, probably a little bit more than we used to award year on year through our facilities programme. So again, having had a bit more income and more opportunity, therefore award funding, and having had more flexibility. Again, if you're only funding facilities and spaces, you're kind of limited by people developing facilities and spaces. Whereas now, if we can fund revenue and activation of spaces, that allows many more organisations to come to us for funding, which is great, but does present a challenge to us. And I think what we found last year was, having been closed from 2020, reopening 2 years later, we were a little bit overwhelmed by demand. So hence, we awarded 4.3 million, which is wonderful. We probably don't have the budget to keep awarding at that level every year. And we also felt that tension between trying to offer a more open and more flexible process, but really give clarity to people so that we're not having lots and lots of applications that we need to turn down because we can't meet the demand. So trying to only generate demand that we can actually reach. So we did, having said everything I've said about trying to keep open and stay open, we actually did pause the fund last year before reopening this year, and now we'll stay open forever. But we did kind of need to pause to take stock of like, let's open and see what demand is out there, what's coming forward with the process as we're running it, get a sense of what type of demand we were going to be faced with and how we could best reach that demand. So last year it was opened, we made lots of awards, we did also reject lots of applications as well, and that didn't feel great to us as a team in terms of how we're supporting the sector. I think it would feel better to us and better for our trustees to have more clarity of exactly what we're trying to fund, what our real priorities are, what our focus areas are, and then people can have much more of a sense of, should I be going for this fund? Is this what's going to fit for me? And I think as well, having said, we don't want to be generating demand and giving the sector that kind of panic around, I've got to apply in because it's going to close. We did close, we paused last year. So we caused some of that and we kind of contributed to that, we know. So we have a big job now around messaging that we now are open and we'll work in that more iterative. We might refine the fund, we might change the priorities, we might have particular focuses at different points, but the fund is broadly open and will stay open. So yeah, we were overwhelmed with demand in year one, so we did pause and reopen, which didn't feel ideal, but also felt necessary for us to kind of be able to take stock and make some of those changes so that we can be more clear for the sector as to what we can offer. Now we're committed to remaining open and refining as we go. As I've mentioned, we have Hal in post in terms of seeking that feedback on every aspect of the process and like making very live changes to the process and how it works. The grant size is something that we continually review, kind of recognizing that there's our budget, there's demand and there's need, there's a desire to have partnership funding coming in as well, but we know that organizations really, the partnership funding is thin on the ground at times for some of these projects. So do we need to actually cover full project costs for some organizations, which we do. The two-stage process that I talked about, that's what we've launched for this year. So last year we ran it as one stage, felt we were overwhelmed with demand. This year, probably a key change is that expression of interest stage, so we can find out a little bit and then let someone know, give them that really early steer, having filled in a very short form. Should you go ahead with a full application? What's the right timing for you? Is your organization and your project ready? Or should you take a little steer from us, get some feedback on your expression of interest and come in later in the year or come in next year at the right time for you? And then in terms of our guidance on our website, just really clarifying more clearly again, exactly what we're looking to fund, what we mean when we talk about capital, what we mean when we talk about spaces. And then in terms of that proportional approach to MEL and outcome setting as well, I think around the question around what organizations we want them to receive funding from us and to be in a better position to receive more funding or feel more sustainable. And part of that is that our MEL process, we hope that the outcomes we're asking them to capture, they're the type of outcomes that organization needs to capture to show what they're doing to themselves, to any other funder, to anyone else they're looking to work with. And that's the approach that we have to MEL, and again that we try and kind of check and challenge ourselves on and take that feedback from grantees too as to how much that's working for them. That's the end of the slides. I'm looking to, in case there's any other questions, or if Hal, having listened to me, has anything to add to. I skipped over.
While we're waiting for questions, and obviously if anyone wants to maybe raise a hand and then we can go around, or you can ask something in the chat. One of the only things I'd add maybe would be around feedback. So we survey grantees at different points. So we survey at application points. So we get an idea from an honest view of our application process. We survey at monitoring and reporting point, and at the end of projects, and then we also survey after our webinars. But something me and the team have been really keen on is making sure that these don't become huge, burdensome surveys. So I think at the moment, on average, none of the surveys take longer than 5 minutes to complete. Which is something we aim, is a good kind of target for us to keep around that figure. We try not to ask for information that we've already got. So we're quite kind of careful and considerate about what we do ask. And as Deirdre says, then we will look at that feedback weekly, and sometimes will be a very quick small change to say, actually, yeah, that's interesting if we are hearing this, or broadly we're comfortable with the feedback and we might have maybe one or two pieces of more constructive feedback, but actually that's in the minority. And if there is something that's either more negative or kind of like significantly negative or constructive, then we'll have a conversation about that week ideally, and hopefully communicate what we think we might change, or try and find out more from the organisation about why it is they had that experience. So it's kind of, I think, hopefully seen as a straightforward process, not overburdensome, and as Deirdre says, live, rather than viewing it as we do it periodically and it's a big kind of upheaval of lots of data. But Marlene?
Really like the idea of it being kind of quick survey and that you've built in time to then sort of act on it almost as it happens, rather than, it's you're asking grantees for feedback and then not, having the time to action it. Just a quick question around whether it's anonymous.
Yeah, so it is. And then we put a question at the very end that sort of says if you'd like to provide your contact details, your organisation name, so that we can get in touch with you. But almost all of them, I'm now putting me on the spot, I think one might be not anonymous, and there's a reason why, but the vast majority or all of them are anonymous. If I remember, I'll come back on the one that is not anonymous, but there was a reason why we didn't have that. But most of them, are anonymous.
I could pick up a little bit more around the question earlier around how we work with our grantees, because I think that's the context of this. We have our Active Spaces Fund. It's one of the things we offer. So we also have a fund we deliver with Sport England and the GLA, which is called Go London. And that's a fund that does provide much more of if they do provide core funding, there's lots of capacity support that's provided with that fund. And then we have our Partnerships Fund that I've mentioned, which is larger grants to organisations that might play that role of capacity building and support for smaller grassroots groups as well. So I think part of this for us is trying to think about, the Active Spaces Fund is one thing we offer. It's not everything. And I guess thinking about the staff team that we have and the resources that we have, we want to run an open fund. We want anyone in London to feel they can at least come and find out what this is and find out if it's for them. And hopefully the funding is flexible enough that the really key organisations we want to reach have a good chance of securing the funding. Running an open programme all across London and the level of budget that we're delivering, I think we know if we are going to being I think what Hal has worked on then is being proportionate, not always just thinking about like the bigger grants get the most attention, but sometimes we'll pick, well, actually this grant, let's look at why we're awarding it and what might they need. It might be the smallest grant we make that year. We might say, well, actually they're going to get a one-to-one meeting with Hal to chat through their MEL and really pick up what they need, or we know who we can signpost them to. So I think it's trying to be really careful with our resources, and probably I think learning from Active Communities Fund, not over promising that we can't offer that to everyone, but if we're, as a funder feeling responsible, if we're going to make that grant to you and we're also going to say, well, they could do it some capacity support and their sustainability doesn't seem clear, like we're making you a grant though, so we're a partner in that, and what can we offer to help with that, rather than just having a report at the end that tells us if they did or didn't get to that point. I think as well on the maybe coming back a little bit to the question about engaging trustees, I think it's an interesting one about the values and change. I think generally we have quite a supportive board of trustees, which is we're definitely fortunate in that respect. And I know from working with different organisations and sitting on boards, that's not always the case. I think there's a few things that the team do well that helps with influencing the board. I think we try and be quite plugged into what's happening in the sector. So different members of the team will share reports, research they've seen, will be quite kind of, I suppose, genuinely interested and curious about what's happening in the sector. Try to attend different events, and that's not just me from a learning point, that's everyone across the team. A few members of the team are volunteers or have other kind of commitments in the sector, so again see things from maybe from a grantee's side of view. And I think there's also quite a good mix in the team as well of people who have worked maybe purely in grant making and sometimes also in project delivery or fundraising as well. So trying to bring all of that to those conversations. And I think when it comes to actually influencing the trustees on a decision, I think tapping into what they value, so understanding the individuals in the room, what they value, understand what they care about as a board, but then also playing back what the sector is saying. So I think sometimes it's quite hard to argue if we're saying, well, actually the sector is moving in this way, we think it's a
progressive way to be moving in terms of better relationships with grantees. So if we were going to go the other way, we'd actually be moving backwards away from the sector. So I think positioning things in that way seems to work quite well, and then doing them over time. So trying to think as far in advance, if we know we're looking to get a decision, thinking about sort of what's the word? Yeah, plugging things in at an early stage, so it doesn't feel like we're coming with a hard change. We've kind of influenced over a longer period of time. Doesn't always work, but it's a start.
This connection, I think, around for us, I suppose we're a sport funder. So say like that, we deliver to some people, we're a sport funder. We deliver a funding in partnership with the GLA and with Sport England, but we're also a funder that funds very small charities and grassroots groups that don't consider themselves to be a sport organisation. So sport and activity, that is our big thing, is getting everyone active, but it's not always going to be delivered. We know, and our trustees know as well, by sports clubs or governing bodies or kind of the real established sports players. I think everyone in the sector acknowledges that reaches a certain section of who we want to reach, but there are all these grassroots groups who consider themselves to be more like a mum's group or a community group or a library walking group or whatever they might be. So trying to, I think the connection for us to London funders and to other funders that aren't connected to our particular slice of the mission is really valuable. So thanks everyone for coming. And we've always benefited from these types of sessions as well. So yeah.
We've got a question. We've got a question in the chat as well, Deirdre, about the proportion of applications that are successful.
Now, I wish I had the actual live data. So we only just reopened in January, and I think from memory we had about 70 or so expressions of interest, and about 25 or so that were successful and have come forward as applications. I can double check and even send an email to follow up. And of those 25, the majority are either the 25 that have come forward as full applications. The majority are either in the pipeline or going forward with recommendations to be awarded. So it's much changed from last year when we had a much higher volume. We might have been closer to, I think, 25% success rate. So I think the expression of interest process so far is working. And I think we also see that as our job really to message that message. You don't need to rush. I think people did in this initial part that we've reopened, which I know we've created that by opening and closing and pausing, so that people know they can take their time and not feel they need to submit an application before they're ready. And that steer at expression of interest stage might be come along to a webinar with us in a couple of months, or let us go and visit you and find out a bit more about it, and then come forward with that full application when you're ready. So trying to, yeah, we have our application process. It's just a way of us knowing what's out there rather than it being like the application and we'll score it and that's how we'll decide everything. So yes, sorry that I don't have the actual stats, but I don't think they're too far off.
I think maybe as well, Deirdre, you kind of said it there, but almost everything we've presented and everything around feedback, around proportion of applications, they're things we're constantly talking about. So I don't think it has come across this way at all, but we're definitely not the experts on these things, and we're constantly having these conversations as a team and with the trustee board as well about these things. So we're in the same.
Final note, I think we talk a lot about how running an open program the way that we are and taking all that feedback in is a little bit like building the boat as we set sail, and there's like good and bad things about that, but like good thing, we can be really responsive, but yeah, it does require, there is resource involved in the team then going back and refining and changing what we're doing and trying to keep an eye on what's core about this fund and how it works and what needs to be shifted and changed. So yeah, we definitely don't consider ourselves to have all the answers, not even all the questions, which is why your questions were great. More food for thought for us.
Thank you so much, Deirdre and Hal. That was great, and especially around kind of the trustee bit, Hal, and that point about sort of understanding what else is happening in the sector, and which is partly what we try to help members with at London Funders, of course. And we've had members of your team coming to different festival sessions, which is really great, and yeah, just brilliant to hear about kind of what you've learned from this process. So a huge thanks to you, and a huge thanks to everyone who joined us as well and asked questions. As I said at the beginning, this is our last day of session, so maybe I will see you later for other things. We also have the festival finale tomorrow, which is kind of wrapping up 2 weeks of learning. So we do hope you can join us for that, and you can find a link to the sign up on the festival website. So yeah, hopefully see you then, and if not, have a great rest of your week, and speak soon.
Thanks everyone.